Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I knew this was going to be a problem the moment I decided to finally tackle my backyard. Not because the project itself was complicated, but because of my neighbor. Let me call her Karen because, well, if you saw her in action, you'd understand why that name fits perfectly. I've lived in my house for about 4 years now. It's a nice little place in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone pretty much keeps to themselves except for the occasional wave when you're getting your mail. The backyard had always been on my mental list of projects to do someday, right between organizing the garage and actually using that gym membership I pay for every month. But this spring, I finally decided someday had arrived. The thing about my property line with Karen is that it was marked by this old railroad tie that had been there since probably the 1980s. The thing was rotting, crumbling, and honestly barely visible in some spots. You could see where it used to be a proper border, but time and weather had not been kind to it. What most people didn't know, including Karen apparently, was that there were actual survey markers in the ground, little iron pins that marked the exact legal property line. They were there if you knew where to look and had the survey documents to reference. Karen, on the other hand, was what I can only describe as the self-appointed queen of our street. Her lawn looked like something out of a magazine, the kind that's so perfectly green and uniform it almost doesn't look real. Because it basically wasn't. I'd seen the lawn service truck there every week, and I'm pretty sure her grass got more chemical treatments than most people's hair. Her front yard was filled with these perfectly arranged red tulips that she was incredibly proud of. She'd mentioned them to me more than once during our brief conversations over the years, and by brief I mean the kind of conversations where she'd find ways to comment on everyone else's landscaping choices. She once told me my recycling bin was an eyesore because I'd left it out an extra hour past pickup time. Another time she mentioned that the smell from my weekend barbecues was overwhelming the delicate scent of her garden. I'm talking about burgers and hot dogs here, not some industrial fish processing plant. So when I started planning my garden project, I knew I needed to be prepared. My plan was to build a raised garden bed along the back property line where that old railroad tie was falling apart. I wanted to plant heirloom roses, something I'd been passionate about since my grandmother got me interested in gardening years ago. It was going to be beautiful and a huge improvement over the rotting wood that was currently marking the border. But knowing Karen like I did, I realized I needed to cover all my bases before I even bought the first bag of soil, so I did two things that turned out to be the smartest decisions I made in this entire situation. First, I paid for a brand new official property survey. It wasn't cheap, but I wanted to know exactly where my property ended and hers began. The surveyor came out, found the original iron markers, and put up fresh flags marking the exact legal property line. They gave me a nice official document with stamps and signatures and everything. Second, I went down to the city planning office and researched all the local zoning requirements. I wanted to make sure my garden bed would be completely legal and compliant with any height restrictions or setback requirements. Turns out, as long as it was under 3 feet high, which mine would be, I didn't need any special permits or approvals. I took all these documents, the new survey, my property deed, and the zoning printouts, and put them in a waterproof folder with a clear label. I called it my Karen insurance because I had a feeling I was going to need it. The project started on a beautiful Saturday morning in late April. The weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with a slight breeze that made working outside actually pleasant. I'd ordered all my materials the week before: good quality cedar boards for the raised bed, premium soil, compost, and 3 gorgeous rose bushes that I'd been researching for months. The survey flags were still in place from when the surveyor had been out, little bright orange flags that clearly marked where my property ended. I started by digging out that old railroad tie, which was honestly more like removing chunks of rotting wood at that point. Some sections just crumbled when I touched them with the shovel. I'd been working for maybe 30 minutes when Karen appeared. I don't mean she walked over or came out her back door. I mean she appeared like she'd been watching from her window and waiting for the exact moment I started disturbing the ground. She walked straight up to the edge of where I was working and said, without any greeting or pleasantries, that I couldn't do what I was doing. I stopped digging and looked up at her. I'd been expecting this conversation, so I kept my voice friendly and calm. I told her good morning and explained that I was just replacing the old border with a proper garden bed. I assured her not to worry because it was all on my side of the property line, and mentioned that I'd had a new survey done to make sure everything was accurate. Karen looked at me like I'd just told her the earth was flat. She pointed at the flags marking the survey line and told me that was wrong. She said the land I was working on was hers, and that my whole project was basically stealing her property. She gestured toward her tulips and said they'd always been the border between our yards. Here's the thing about those tulips. They were beautiful, I'll give her that, but they were planted a good 5 feet inside her own yard, nowhere near the actual property line. It was like saying the lamp in my living room marked where my kitchen began. I didn't want to escalate the situation, so I kept things simple. I told her everything I was doing was to code and legal, and then went back to digging. I figured if I didn't engage with the argument, maybe she'd just drop it and go back inside. That turned out to be the wrong approach. My polite dismissal seemed to fuel her anger rather than diffuse it. She stood there for another minute watching me work, and I could practically feel the rage building. Then she stormed off toward her house, but not before yelling loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear that we'd see what the law had to say about my illegal construction. I kept working. Over the next week, I built the raised bed exactly where I'd planned, staying well within the flagged boundaries of my property. The bed was about 18 inches high, filled with the premium soil I'd bought, and planted with my 3 prized rose bushes. It looked fantastic and was clearly an improvement over the rotting railroad tie that had been there before. Karen didn't come over to talk during that week, but I could see her watching from her windows whenever I was outside working. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her standing by her back door, just staring at my progress. It was honestly a bit creepy, but I figured as long as she was staying on her side of the property line, it wasn't my problem. The garden bed was finished on a Friday, and I spent Saturday morning doing the final touches. Watering the new plants, adding a thin layer of mulch around the roses, just enjoying the satisfaction of a project completed. It was one of those perfect spring mornings where the temperature was just right and everything felt possible. I was out there with my coffee, watering the first rose bush and thinking about how nice it was going to look in a few years when the plants filled out. That's when I heard the sirens. I didn't even flinch. I just picked up my coffee cup and waited, because somehow deep down, I'd been expecting this moment all week. 2 police cars pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers got out, one older guy who had the tired expression of someone who'd seen every possible kind of neighborhood drama, and a younger officer who looked more official and by the book. They walked up my driveway while Karen emerged from her house. She was still in her bathrobe even though it was almost 10 in the morning, and she had this look of pure, triumphant satisfaction on her face, like she'd just won the lottery and was about to collect her prize. She marched over to the officers with her arms crossed, pointing at me dramatically. Karen announced to the officers that they'd arrived just in time and demanded they arrest me immediately. She claimed I was trespassing on her property and had been for over a week. She went on about how she was just trying to enjoy her peaceful morning when I decided to build illegal structures on her land and destroy her property value. She was loud enough that I could see neighbors starting to peek out their windows and come onto their porches. Karen was clearly putting on a show for the entire street, and she was loving every second of it. The older officer, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, walked over to where I was standing by my roses. He greeted me politely and asked what was going on. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Karen screeched from across the yard that she'd already told them everything they needed to know. She said I was trespassing and pointed dramatically at my garden bed. Then she did something that made my jaw drop. She marched over to my beautiful new garden bed and planted her foot right in the fresh soil, inches away from one of my rose bushes. She announced to the officers that this was her dirt and her land. The officer immediately told her to step back from my garden and asked me to give him my version of what was happening. I told him to hold on for just one moment, went inside my house, and came back with my folder of documents. The one I'd been calling my Karen insurance for the past month. I handed the folder to the officer and calmly explained what was inside. The official survey that had been conducted just 2 weeks earlier, with the flag still clearly visible marking the property line, my property deed showing the legal boundaries, and the local zoning code printouts that proved my garden bed was completely compliant with all regulations. While the officer was looking through my paperwork, I could see Karen starting to panic. The smug confidence was draining from her face as she realized this wasn't going according to her plan. She announced loudly that she had proof too, then ran into her house. We all stood there in slightly awkward silence for a few minutes while the officers continued reviewing my documents. I could hear Karen rummaging around inside, opening and closing drawers, clearly searching for something. She finally came back outside, waving a piece of paper above her head like it was some kind of smoking gun. When she got closer, I could see it was a printout from a computer. Specifically, it looked like a screenshot from a real estate website. Karen thrust the paper at the officers and declared that this was proof that her property extended all the way to my back door. She'd printed out one of those aerial view maps from a home valuation website, the kind with the fuzzy, approximate property lines that they put on real estate listings. She pointed at the blurry boundary lines on the printout and insisted that the internet proved she was right. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The younger officer actually turned away for a second, and I'm pretty sure he was trying not to smile. The older officer just sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his soul. He handed Karen's printout back to her and explained very patiently that what she'd brought was not a legal document. He told her it was just a website estimate and couldn't be used to determine actual property boundaries. Then he held up my official survey with all its stamps and signatures and explained that this was a legal document. He pointed out that according to the survey, I was actually working about 2 inches inside my own property line. He also noted that Karen was currently standing on my property. Karen's face went through an amazing transformation. First, she turned completely pale, like all the blood had drained away. Then she turned bright red, darker than her precious tulips. She started yelling that the officer was lying and taking my side. She demanded that he arrest me immediately for trespassing. The officer's patience was clearly reaching its limit. He told Karen firmly to stop talking and walked back to his car. I could see him talking on his radio and then looking at something on his computer screen. This went on for several minutes while Karen paced around her yard, muttering angrily to herself. When the officer came back, he was carrying a citation book. His whole demeanor had changed. He was no longer trying to be diplomatic or friendly. He had the official, no-nonsense attitude that police officers get when they're done playing games. He asked Karen to confirm her name and address, which seemed to give her hope that she was finally going to get the result she wanted. She answered eagerly, probably thinking he was about to arrest me. Instead, the officer started reading from his computer notes. He told Karen that he could see police had been dispatched to this address 6 times in the past year for what he called non-emergency civil complaints, twice for noise complaints about a lawnmower being used during legal daytime hours, once for a suspicious person report that turned out to be a food delivery driver, and 3 times for property line disputes that had no basis in fact. I watched Karen's triumphant expression slowly dissolve into pure panic as she realized where this was heading. The officer continued by saying they'd warned Karen previously about misusing the 911 system for non-emergencies. He confirmed that I was not trespassing and was in fact working entirely on my own property. He told Karen that by calling the police when she knew there was no actual crime taking place, she had knowingly filed a false report and wasted city resources. Then he tore a page out of his citation book. He explained that he was issuing Karen a citation for filing a false police report, which was a misdemeanor charge. He handed her the white slip of paper and told her the court date was printed on the bottom. He warned her that she needed to stop making frivolous police reports and wished her a good day. Karen just stood there holding the citation, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She seemed genuinely shocked that her plan had backfired so spectacularly. The officers nodded to me as they prepared to leave. The younger one complimented my roses and told me to have a good Saturday. They got in their cars and drove away, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the yard clutching her citation. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, and it was even better than I'd imagined. Karen was completely silent for the first time since I'd met her. All her bluster and demands and threats had evaporated, replaced by the reality of holding a legal citation in her hands. The neighbors who had come out to watch the drama were slowly closing their doors and windows, returning to their normal Saturday morning activities. The show was over, and Karen had definitely not been the star she'd intended to be. I didn't say a single word to her. I didn't gloat or make any comments about the situation. I simply picked up my watering can and calmly resumed watering my rose bushes, completely ignoring her presence. The sound of the water hitting the soil was the only noise in the yard. Karen continued standing there, staring at the citation and then at me, clearly trying to process what had just happened. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out how her foolproof plan had resulted in her getting a ticket instead of me getting arrested. Every few minutes she'd open her mouth like she was going to say something, but then close it again. I just kept watering my plants, moving methodically from one rose bush to the next, giving each one the attention it deserved. After about 10 minutes of this silent standoff, Karen finally stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. But I could see her watching me from her kitchen window as I finished my watering and then sat down on my back porch with my coffee to admire my handiwork. The roses were beautiful, even as young plants. In a few years, they'd be spectacular. But even more than the gardening success, I felt satisfied with how I'd handled the situation. By being prepared, staying calm, and having all my documentation in order, I'd turned Karen's attempt to cause problems for me into problems for herself. I spent the rest of that Saturday enjoying my peaceful backyard, reading a book on my porch, and occasionally watering my new garden bed. Karen never came back outside, though I caught glimpses of her peering through her blinds from time to time. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic between us shifted completely, where she used to find excuses to come outside when I was in my yard, and now she seemed to actively avoid being out there at the same time. When we did see each other, she'd quickly look away and hurry back inside. The citation apparently wasn't just an empty threat. About a month later, I saw her leaving the house dressed up more formally than usual, with a manila folder in her hand. I assumed she was heading to court to deal with her false reporting charge. My roses, meanwhile, were thriving. The raised bed provided perfect drainage, and the premium soil I'd invested in was clearly worth the money. The plants were already showing new growth and would likely have their first blooms by early summer. But the story wasn't quite over yet, because Karen, as I was about to learn, wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. About 2 weeks after the police citation incident, I started noticing some weird stuff happening around my property. Nothing major at first, just little things that seemed off. My morning newspaper would be missing from my driveway, even though I could see it had been delivered because my neighbor across the street always got his at the same time. My recycling bin got knocked over a couple times, spilling cans and bottles across my driveway. I didn't think much of it initially. Could have been wind or dogs or just random neighborhood stuff. But then I came home from work one evening to find my garden hose had been moved. I always coiled it neatly next to my back porch, but that day it was stretched across my yard and the nozzle was left running, flooding part of my lawn. That's when I started paying closer attention, and that's when I noticed Karen's new routine. She'd started taking what she called her evening constitutional around the neighborhood. This was a woman who I'd never seen exercise or even walk to her mailbox if she could drive. But suddenly she was out there every evening around 6, walking slowly past my house, always slowing down when she got to my property line. During one of these walks, she stopped to chat with Mrs. Wilson from 2 houses down. I was working in my front garden and couldn't help overhearing parts of their conversation. Karen was telling Mrs. Wilson about what she called the property line situation, and how some people in the neighborhood didn't respect boundaries or community standards. She was trying to turn the neighborhood against me. The woman who had gotten a citation for filing false police reports was now attempting to paint me as the problem neighbor. But here's the thing about our neighborhood. Most people had lived here for years and had watched Karen's behavior long before I moved in. Mrs. Wilson later told me privately that Karen had complained to her about every single neighbor on the street at one point or another. The family with the kids made too much noise. The elderly man with the small dog let it bark too much. The couple who worked night shifts parked their car wrong. So when Karen tried to recruit allies for her campaign against me, she didn't get the response she was hoping for. Instead, people started avoiding her on her evening walks. I'd see neighbors quickly ducking back inside when they spotted her coming down the sidewalk. Meanwhile, my roses were absolutely thriving. By mid-June, they had their first blooms, and they were gorgeous. The variety I'd chosen was known for its fragrance, and on warm evenings, the scent would drift across my backyard. Even some of the other neighbors commented on how beautiful they looked when they passed by. This seemed to make Karen even more frustrated. Her perfectly uniform tulips had finished blooming for the season, leaving her front yard looking pretty bland compared to my flowering roses. I caught her staring at my garden bed from her kitchen window more than once, and the expression on her face was pure resentment. Then came the escalation I should have seen coming. It was a Thursday evening in late June. I'd gotten home from work and was out back watering my roses and checking on their progress. The evening was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the floral scent around the yard. I heard my front doorbell ring, which was unusual since most people who knew me well enough to visit would call first. I went to answer it and found 2 official-looking people in business attire standing on my porch. They introduced themselves as code enforcement officers from the city. They explained that they'd received a complaint about unpermitted construction on my property and needed to inspect what they described as an illegal structure in my backyard. They were polite but serious, and they had clipboards and measuring tools with them. I immediately knew who had called them, but I stayed calm and invited them to see the garden bed. I also mentioned that I had all the documentation showing the project was completely legal and compliant with city codes. We walked around to the backyard where my beautiful roses were in full bloom. The officers measured the height of the raised bed, checked the setback from the property line, and examined the construction materials. Meanwhile, I went inside and got my folder of documents again. I showed them the zoning compliance research I'd done, the building height requirements, and the survey showing the bed was entirely on my property. One of the officers took photos of everything while the other filled out paperwork on his clipboard. After about 20 minutes of inspection, the senior officer told me everything looked completely legal and properly constructed. He said they'd gotten a complaint claiming I had built an unpermitted shed or garage, but obviously that wasn't the case. He seemed a bit annoyed that someone had wasted their time with such a clearly frivolous report. As they were preparing to leave, I asked if they could tell me who had filed the complaint. The officer said they couldn't give me specific names, but he did mention that the same address had filed 3 other code enforcement complaints in the past month that had all turned out to be unfounded. He suggested that whoever was making these reports might want to familiarize themselves with actual city codes before calling in the future. I thanked them for their time and professionalism. As they walked back to their car, I saw Karen's kitchen curtains fall back into place. She'd been watching the entire inspection from her window. This was getting ridiculous. Karen had now involved the police, code enforcement, and was trying to turn the neighbors against me, all because I'd built a legal garden bed on my own property. But I realized she'd made a crucial mistake with this latest stunt. The next day, I called the code enforcement office and spoke to a supervisor. I explained the situation and asked about the process for filing complaints against someone who was repeatedly making false reports. The supervisor was very interested in what I had to say, especially when I mentioned this was the same person who had recently gotten a police citation for filing false reports. He told me they took fraudulent complaints seriously because they wasted city resources and prevented officers from responding to legitimate issues. He asked if I'd be willing to file a formal complaint against Karen for harassment through false reporting. I said I would, and he scheduled an appointment for me to come in and provide a statement. He also mentioned that if someone continued filing false reports after being warned, it could result in fines and legal action. When I went to the city office the following week, I brought copies of all my documentation about the garden project, plus photos showing the roses in bloom and measurements proving everything was legal. The supervisor reviewed everything and told me they would send Karen an official warning letter about filing false complaints. He also mentioned something interesting. Apparently, Karen had called about several other properties in our neighborhood over the past year. She'd reported the family with kids for having a junk car in their driveway that turned out to be a perfectly legal project car. She'd complained about the elderly man's doghouse being too large when it was well within size limits. She'd even reported the couple who worked nights for having commercial vehicles that were actually just personal trucks. The pattern was clear. Karen wasn't just targeting me. She was using city services as her personal weapon against anyone in the neighborhood who didn't meet her standards. But here's where the story gets really satisfying. About a week later, I was out front checking my mail when I saw a city vehicle pull up to Karen's house. It wasn't code enforcement this time. It was someone from the water department, and they had serious-looking equipment with them. Apparently, someone had reported a suspected water leak on Karen's property. The water department takes these reports seriously because leaks can waste thousands of gallons and cause damage to surrounding properties. So they'd come out to do a full inspection of Karen's water lines. The inspection involved digging up parts of her precious front lawn to access the water meter and main line. They also had to check around her house foundation and test water pressure throughout the system. The whole process took most of the day and left her yard looking like a construction zone. Of course, they didn't find any leak. Karen's water system was fine, but the inspection had been called in as an emergency, so they'd had to respond immediately and do a thorough check. I have no idea who might have called in that report. Could have been anyone in the neighborhood who was tired of Karen's harassment campaigns. Could have been someone who thought turnabout was fair play. Could have been a complete coincidence. But watching Karen stand in her destroyed front yard surrounded by piles of dirt and damaged grass while the water department workers explained that no leak had been found was absolutely priceless. Her perfect lawn was ruined, her prized tulip bed had been partially dug up, and she was dealing with the same kind of false report frustration she'd been putting everyone else through. The next day, I noticed Karen had a landscaping company come out to assess the damage and give her an estimate for repairs. I couldn't help but smile as I watered my beautiful roses, which were now in peak bloom and attracting butterflies and bees from all over the neighborhood. That evening, Mrs. Wilson stopped by to compliment my garden and mention how nice it was to have someone in the neighborhood who actually improved their property instead of just complaining about everyone else's. We had a pleasant conversation about gardening while Karen watched from her window, standing in her torn-up yard. Over the next few weeks, Karen's attitude changed completely. She stopped taking her evening walks past my house. She stopped staring at my garden from her windows. She even gave me a brief nod when we happened to be getting our mail at the same time, which was more courtesy than she'd ever shown before. I later found out through the neighborhood grapevine that Karen had received not just the warning letter about false code enforcement reports, but also a fine from the city for repeated frivolous complaints. Apparently, when they investigated her complaint history, they found enough false reports to justify financial penalties. My roses continued to flourish through the summer and into fall. The raised bed provided perfect growing conditions, and the plants rewarded my care with abundant blooms and incredible fragrance. Several neighbors asked me for advice on their own gardening projects, and I was happy to share what I'd learned. As winter approached and it was time to prepare the roses for dormancy, I reflected on the whole situation. By staying calm, being prepared with proper documentation, and letting Karen's own behavior work against her, I'd not only protected my project but actually improved my standing in the neighborhood. Karen's tulips came back the following spring, but her yard never quite recovered the pristine appearance she'd been so proud of. She'd learned the hard way that trying to weaponize city services against innocent neighbors could backfire in spectacular fashion. My roses, on the other hand, came back bigger and more beautiful than ever, and every time I water them on a peaceful Saturday morning, I remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and letting difficult people create their own consequences. That was the day my roses officially beat her tulips, her temper, her Zillow printout, and her entire campaign of neighborhood harassment. I've never had a more satisfying gardening season, and I doubt Karen will ever try to mess with me or my property again. Sometimes being prepared and staying calm is the most powerful response to entitled behavior, and sometimes the best victory is the quiet satisfaction of watching your roses bloom while someone else deals with the mess they created for themselves. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So I work at a large company, Fortune 50 company. But like everywhere, management comes up with one-size-fits-none metrics. The latest was revealed to us by our manager, who surprisingly is the hero of this story. It has always been the metric that if you fell below 70% of your quota on a quota-eligible role, you risk being put on a performance review plan. It is also well known that anyone getting on a PRP is pretty much toast. Either you get fired for failing the PRP, or you are first on the next layoff list. And usually they replace you with a newbie fresh out of college, in one of the lower two bands. My particular team is made up of all senior people. Every one of us is in one of the top 2 skill grades, so we know we are a target, which is insane, as all of us engage the C-suite at other very large Fortune 500 companies and act as trusted advisors. We cannot be replaced by a new grad with intern-level performance. So our intrepid hero, my boss, is pulled into a 2-day seminar about 2 months ago that goes all the way to the General Manager of Sales Americas. Several senior HR managers are there too. It is a rare in-person meeting, so people are cautious, but at least they know it is not a mass layoff kind of deal, as the first day is about the path forward and how important our division is to the company strategy. They go on about how our division is the front line of expanding sales in our partner program to take it from 60% of revenue to 85% of revenue, with 75% of new growth expected to come from the partner channels. The company absolute is relying on our division and our skilled staff to deliver on that goal. The second day is different, however. In the afternoon, they lay out the new plan for technical sellers, 80% attainment per year, and backdating 2 years. It is a rare in-person meeting, so people are cautious, but my manager goes into I am just asking questions mode. So let me understand, if last year they hit 100% attainment and 75% of the team did, but the previous year they hit 79%, then they are on a PRP, HR hems and haws? Well, yes, that is how it would work. I see. And there is no exceptions? The GM speaks up. That's correct. Everyone must be a top performer. No exceptions. My manager starts gathering his things up. Would you mind if I skip the rest of the day? I have a lot of work to do, apparently. The GM looks at him. Well, no. We have more to cover. What is so urgent? He looks at the GM and maliciously complies with the stated metrics. Based on the metrics and the no exceptions rule, I have to prepare PRPs for my entire team. No exceptions. I will need to start the open headcount to hire replacements for everyone, too. The GM looks confused, attempting to digest this new information. Most of the rest of the managers stick their hands up. We need to go too. We need to write up PRPs for all our people too, and submit open headcounts. A quick count shows that 80% of our division would be on a PRP. Given the failure rate, that means about 70% of the team will be fired, 10% will be laid off, and 20% will remain. For the growth strategy of the company, the tip of the spear in partner sales. My boss points out that retention of personnel and reduced turnover is part of the roll-up objectives, as well as attainment of his reports. That means he will be PRP'd, as will his manager and her manager, all the way up the chain. No exceptions. The meeting wraps up after the discussion dies down and the GM says they are not implementing this now, but in a few months. In those 2 months, there are more online meetings, questions asked, more data pulled from the HR systems, meetings with HR and legal, who is now very interested in this plan of theirs, culminating in a meeting this last Monday where the revised plan is revealed. A new exceptions plan has been put in place at the insistence of the legal department. Gone is the informal, put together a package to be evaluated for an optional exception for your employee. Now, there is a set of formal exceptions that cover a number of categories. Legal ones like taking family leave or medical short-term disability in the last 3, and functional ones like having been moved between departments or job titles or having a non-quota designation in the last 2 years. If the quota plan changed significantly or had a metric with no previous history to set the target, there is 10 or 12 categories, depending if you count the overlaps. An exception resets the timer to the next calendar year, so if someone qualifies in January, they are off the hook until next January. Turns out everyone in the division now qualifies for one or more of those exceptions. Imagine that. Epilogue. Turns out HR did not do an analysis of how many people would be impacted in our division as the numbers were done worldwide over 100K employees with quota, not by department. Their number said 11% of us would end up on PRPs. Let's not get into how they are trying to reduce headcount by driving people into leaving or retiring early. Also, when legal found out they were backdating the requirement, they went ballistic. Legal also went spare when they saw no exceptions for federally protected leave like family or medical disability. Gotta love my boss. He looks out for us. Often by maliciously complying with stupid requirements. Anyway, thank you for watching.